next time I'm just going to sit with a portable mic and say, all right, Rick, next up. I am thrilled and honored that we have Rick Boothman tonight as our keynote. You know, most of you know about the data, about the money they've saved but I always have the pleasure of sitting with him at other meetings, and we talk about the stories and the human connections. And tonight I asked him, if you have to do numbers, all right, but really I want to hear about the human side of this work and what inspires you. So without further ado, Rick, welcome.
Thank you, Linda. She just told me I have only a few minutes, which is cruel and unusual punishment, especially for a lawyer. If you would indulge just a couple of personal comments first. I was raised to believe that the measure of a man is taken, and by extension, a community is taken, not whether you get knocked down or not, but how you handle it afterwards. The whole world watched you after the horrible events of the marathon and what happened afterwards. And I just want to tell you how honored I am to be here because you made us all proud. Thank you very much. The second thing, on a lighter note, the second thing on a lighter note is that I bring congratulations to you from Detroit for the World Series victory. You beat us soundly, and you beat those guys afterwards, but I know that I sound like my mother when I say, I really don't like those beards. Those guys look like hell, I'm sorry, but they just did. So we'll agree to disagree on that, but we can agree on one thing. Thank God we didn't have to watch the Yankees, right? Thank you for coming tonight to this important event for this important organization. Organization like MITSS and the one on whose board I sit, the National Patient Safety Foundation, are more important than we think and deserve our strong support. This year's theme is Bridging the Gaps. I want to talk about what we've learned along those lines in the 12 years of the Michigan model. But I would beg that you let me digress a bit to something different. Put you back into 2008. In December of 2008, the Iraq government approved a status of forces agreement, which provided for a phased withdrawal of the United States troops. President George Bush hailed it as a proof of victory and validation of a controversial surge. And yet tens of thousands of Iraqis burned his effigy in the streets as they protested what they saw as a fraudulent war and a humiliating occupation. And on December 14th of 2008, you'll remember this, at a self-congratulatory press conference, an Iraqi journalist whose name is Muqtada al-Zaidi threw his shoes at President Bush. And apparently in the Arab culture, showing someone the soles of your feet is a sign of contempt. And he threw the first shoe shouting, this is a goodbye kiss from the Iraqi people. And he threw the second shoe and he said, this is for the widows and orphans and all those killed in the war. He was wrestled to the ground. He was beaten severely and hauled away and later sentenced to 3 years in prison and reportedly tortured. And later the same day, at another press conference, with a characteristic self-indulgent smirk and swagger, President Bush said and quipped, if you want the facts, it's a size 10. I can't stop playing that incident, even though it's 5 years ago. I can't stop playing that incident over and over in my head because I think to myself, what if? What if? In the chaos that followed that incident, as that man was being wrestled to the ground and beaten, the United States president had stepped down off the dais, parted the crowd, and helped him up. What if? Wouldn't that have been one heck of a scene? What if he had recognized the depth of emotion that had driven that man to do something so risky, so desperate, so dangerous, the same emotion that was driving thousands of people into the street to protest our presence? What if the president had invited him to privately talk about the harm that mistaken war had done, what it meant for his country, and our shared sacrifices in that whole thing? I think it would have been a stunning scene, wouldn't it? And we play that video at the University of Michigan over and over and over on a much smaller scale every month. It takes more guts to understand than it does to make light of a man's desperation. It's a lot easier to label somebody than it is to get to know them. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength, and it's a sign of moral conviction, and it's a sign of compassion, and it's a sign of respect. That was an opportunity, in my opinion, on a very basic level, to demonstrate that though we shared sacrifices that were profound and intimate with the Iraqi people, we recognized the greater impact it had on them and their country. And what a statement it would have been to the people of Iraq, to the people of the Middle East, to the people of the world. So I think about that often, and I think about that in terms of bridging the gap. What are we afraid of? Why are we so reluctant to reach down and help somebody who's been hurt? Why is it so hard for us to make those human connections? At the University of Michigan in 2001, we embarked on a simple idea: reach out to people who were hurt, be honest, disclose our mistakes, and for God's sakes, learn from our mistakes. It was really simple. Much has been made of our apologies and the financial impact that it's had on malpractice costs and malpractice numbers, but most reporters completely overlook the significance, the larger significance of the first disclosure. The first disclosure is not to the patient who's been harmed or his or her family. The first disclosure is to us. And if we can't arrive at that degree of honesty with ourselves, we'll never make it with anybody else. That's the gap we need to bridge first. So even as I applaud people like Steve Kramen, who was the pioneer of a proactive and principled approach to medical malpractice claims, and somebody like Tim, who is taking the ball and running with it in all sorts of ways even I couldn't have imagined, and people like my good friends Alan Woodward and Ken Sands and Melinda Van Neel, who here in Boston are doing some amazing things with 6 or 8 hospitals, I lost track of how many, even as they push and make progress, the progress is still too slow. Too slow because I think we all have trouble with that first disclosure. So I received my license to practice law 33 years ago, and my wife Karen will tell you that I was then and remain especially well suited to argument. The legal profession proved a good fit. It is still true that I have trouble walking away from a fight and have even more trouble picking which fights I should fight. But regardless of my orientation, I've been humbled by the privilege and by the magnitude of what I've seen in my career, and I'm mystified why the progress is so slow. It was common when I started, and it may still be, that lawyers representing doctors and hospitals treated patients and the lawyers who represented them with great disrespect, as though there was something slimy and wrong and opportunistic about them making a claim. I was good at understanding the medicine, and that's not bad for an English major. I could understand the medicine, and I was pretty good at understanding the caregivers. But I could not avoid seeing what we looked like and what the care we delivered looked like through the eyes of people who had sustained some of the most painstaking and profound losses. And I don't know how anybody in my business hasn't felt the same. I've never understood the ease with which we label plaintiffs, patients, and their lawyers. As a trial lawyer, I knew how important open access was to our free society, but I realized pretty quickly that there was something fundamentally harmful to everybody involved when litigation is the only means to resolving these disputes. And I guess I overspoke a bit. There's a little hyperbole. It wasn't harmful to everybody because those of us who made our living in the business did quite well. Thank you very much. But we abandoned our patients and we rationalize that there's something wrong with them when they complain. We leave them no alternative but the courtroom, and then we brand them as litigious when they file suit to stand up for themselves, or even just get information and answers. We forced patients to sue us, and then we use the damage that litigation causes our caregivers as an excuse to never reach down and help somebody we've hurt. That lack of logic has impressed me for a long time. And in 2001, we were determined to do something about it. So in 2001, at the university, we behaved counterintuitive to the prevailing wisdom at the time. We made a difficult disclosure to ourselves when we hurt people, in preventable ways anyway, and we discovered that it wasn't so bad. In fact, it opened the doors to all sorts of interesting experiences. So I'm not a good role model for how to roll this out. I did it without asking for permission. And I did it kind of under the radar until that first early case. There was a point in time when a lady and her boyfriend came to visit me, and she was complaining about her cosmetic breast surgery, and she sat in my office, defiantly topless, for 2 hours. And the entire office swirled by the door to look in to see what the heck was going on. And I've had other experiences like that. After sending a letter to a man who claimed that he had nerve injury from a hip replacement, I had done a thorough investigation. I sent him a full written disclosure, and I said, "I'm sorry, but I think you had a pre-existing back injury, which is really the source for your nerve injury. It's not the hip, and I'm sorry that you have the problem, but it's not a case for compensation." In one of the only times I've felt threatened, he burst into my office unannounced one day, and I really thought he was going to shoot me. He was so angry, he was almost incoherent. But he bent over, pulled his pants and underwear down, and pointed to his buttock and said, "You've made me a half-ass." I've had some interesting experiences. I was also investigating once a hip replacement case, another hip replacement case, a surgery that seemed by all signs to have gone flawlessly. The rehab had gone flawlessly, but 18 months later, a fracture was seen. I squirmed as a couple told me without a shred of embarrassment about their acrobatic intimacies to explain what happened when she first started having creaking in her hip. It is an interesting experience, a set of experiences. But I've also seen the most hardened and seemingly arrogant cardiac surgeon sob uncontrollably when confronted by a family not with a medical mistake, but by his profound lack of compassion as they watched their father die waiting for surgery for aortic dissection. I've seen a patient break down. I've seen a patient break down in the presence of his lawyer and spontaneously hug the surgeon he was threatening to sue once he realized all the true facts. The husband of a woman who died at our institution got angry with me for suggesting that he was entitled to compensation. 3 nurses had made profound mistakes that probably contributed, if not caused, his wife's death. And he said to me, "Don't be punitive to those nurses. They worked hard and everybody makes mistakes." I had to explain to a large family that their loved one died not too long ago for one of the worst reasons that I can imagine. The arrogance of a trauma surgeon who refused to heed a nurse who was telling her repeatedly he thought the breathing tube was in the patient's esophagus. And she lectured him about his place while that patient struggled for air. I met 2 weeks ago with a family intending to explain to them why their 18-year-old died and not as a result of medical error. And I then sat stupefied listening to the father tell me what it was like to greet his son after what they thought was miraculous cardiac surgery. And while he was standing at the bedside, the sutures placed in a graft pulled through some abnormal tissue, and within minutes, the father watched the life leave his son's eyes. This is not about malpractice numbers. This is really much more elemental than that. Not too long ago, a couple of months ago, Tom Gallagher and Tim McDonald arranged for a group of us to go to the United States Senate, and we talked to some folks there. And Alan Woodward made a simple observation that was so profound it caused me to stop and think. He said to those in the Senate, after all of us went on about the details of what we're doing, he said to those in the Senate, understand one thing, no hospital that's had the courage to do this has ever gone back. And I think that's true. I've never heard anybody say, let's go back into deny and defend. This apology business isn't working. I can't claim that we've got it fixed. I can't tell you that we've got it right, but we've seen enough and we're never going back. And Alan's comment made me start to think, when did I know we were never going back? We weren't going back, I think. I knew we weren't going back when I received the first email from a resident who actually listed the University of Michigan as the place she wanted to do her specialty training exclusively because of how we treat our patients and our caregivers with honesty and dignity. I knew we weren't going back when a neurosurgery resident responsible for delivering a 10-fold overdose of heparin not only figured it out himself, self-reported in minutes, but then as she lay dying, asked to apologize and explain to the family. And I knew we were not going back when the sister of that dying woman walked out of the room with that sobbing resident and put her arm around him and said, we've watched you for days. You're good at what you do. It's clear that you care. You will help a lot of people in your life. Remember my sister, but don't you dare quit. Isn't this stunning? I knew we weren't going back when I presented a graph of our malpractice costs and that sort of thing to our health system leadership. And for the first time, instead of hearing about overhead and about the costs of doing business and trends and finances, I overheard one member of the C-suite say, God help us for the people we've hurt. Well, what have we learned? We've learned that we're not as good as we want to believe, and that doesn't feel very good. We've learned that the stereotypes we've spent decades building are untrue, that patients are far more forgiving than anybody ever thought on our end, and that the lawyers who represent them are largely honorable and in it for the right reason. We just need to give them a chance to understand instead of giving them a one-way ticket to the courtroom. And that feels good, and that feels a sense of optimism. We've learned that when you act ethically, you tend to bring up everybody around you. And the game disappears. Malpractice moves into the background. It's important background noise, but it's background noise to what's really important. And most importantly, we've learned what accountability feels like, that it doesn't always feel good either, but that discomfort drives our determination to improve our care. We will improve our care, not just our excuses. And that can only be derived from a sense of accountability. We've learned that patients and caregivers almost always start from the same place, a sacred place in which they're joined around a common purpose, making the patient better, alleviating pain and misery. We've learned that that relationship is key, and the mission is precious, and we should not abandon it so easily when things go wrong. We've learned, well, we haven't learned, but we're still learning, that instead of honing our defenses, we should be working on the quality of that sacred relationship. We've learned the hard way what organizations like MITSS and the National Patient Safety Foundation and individuals like Patty Skolnick and Helen Haskell and Linda Kenny already know, that we are far from being patient-centered. We're not patient and family-centered when patients' options for care are governed more by referral relationships or reimbursement incentives or the need to get returns on expensive medical investments than they are by the patient's individualized needs. We're not patient-centered when informed consent still, too often, is just getting a piece of paper signed. We're not patient-centered when the most we can hope for right now is an intelligent conversation when we're about to have a procedure and not otherwise be the norm. We're not patient and family-centered when our entire government shuts down because one political party in this country hates the idea that every American should have the means to pay for their care. If I've learned anything at all, it's this. We need to recognize that we're all in this together. It's not just caregivers and patients, but all of us who support them, whether you're a vendor, whether you're a family, whether you're a friend, and yes, even lawyers. Lawyers need to understand that they do nobody any favors by defending care that shouldn't be defended, or prosecuting claims that shouldn't be prosecuted, or advocating for draconian tort reforms, or protecting challenged caregivers and challenging practices. We need to work harder to create and preserve that sacred relationship because we're all in this together. Yes, we've learned a lot and we've made some progress, and I'm really gratified to see the things that people like Tim McDonald and others are doing through courage and enthusiasm, but we cannot stop fighting because we still have a very long way to go. So back to President Bush and the journalist. Think about that visual alone. Imagine YouTube playing that over and over and over millions of times. That compassionate act of stepping down and helping that man. That video would have been stunning, but it's more than just the visual that matters. It's the quality of our actions depend entirely on the level of our understanding. Had President Bush actually done that, had he literally sat down and showed some interest in what was really going on in the Iraqi people, had he listened, had we listened, it might have changed the way we conducted ourselves in that country. It might have changed the way we see these things across the board. It might have changed the way we handle similar situations elsewhere. And maybe I'm guilty of a little grandiosity, but I see our situation in that as a microcosm. Fundamentally, I know we won't improve until we reach down to help the people we've hurt and see the world through their eyes. So to all the naysayers and the fear-mongers who keep saying to me over and over, "You're crazy, it won't work here," I say this: nothing bad can ever happen when you step down, part the crowd, help somebody up, and try to understand. Show them compassion and respect. I don't think anything bad can happen. And the real truth is this: we stand to benefit more than the person to whom we've shown that respect. We're changed by it. And if we embrace that experience, if we value it, if we heed it, that change enriches everything we do. So Linda Kenny knew that when she showed that amazing generosity of spirit that ignited MITSS. A lot of people know that. Thank you to MITSS for what you do. And the only parting comment I have, or parting advice, is this: let's find the courage to expect more from our government, expect more from our health systems, and expect more from ourselves. Thank you for listening.